Hello everyone, so it's Ren here. Hope you all doing great, guys. While we are at it, let's continue looking at fantasies, core fundamental fantasies that really permeate the unconscious life of non-INFJs, non-NI dominants, in fact, of people who don't have the INFJ functions, at least not consciously. Today we're going to be looking at FI. I wrote some paragraphs in my notes regarding the FI function. It's a function of the INTJ. In that regard, it's of course valid and important to look into for any NI dominant. FI might be an interesting topic for those of you who would like to see me talk more about INFPs and ISFPs. Also, I have a patron that I'm greeting who was recently talking about his interest in seeing more INFP videos. This will be relevant, of course. Now, of course, FI is not an easy function for me to talk about because it's not a function that I have at my disposal, so to speak. You know, it's somewhere in my unconscious, but it's pretty deep, and it took me a while to come to grips with what could be its core fantasy. But what helped me, I have to say, what helped me is elaborating on the FE fantasy, because intuitively we know that FI and FE are quite opposed in many ways. They most articulate, in my own vocabulary, narratives that do not mix well. When I say narratives that do not mix well, I think this is better than saying that they're opposed, because I don't like this idea of antinomy between functions. However, the idea that they're not mixed well, it conveys nicely the idea that maybe you can sort of mix them a bit, but it's often going to be tricky and slippery and might not turn out all that good, you know? So what we know about FE judgment is that, and this is something that I've elaborated about judgment as well, is that FE tends to see itself as legitimized in the eyes of the world by holding values and emotions, or rather, to be more precise, values and feelings that have, in principle, universal shareability, and in fact ought to be shared, right? The more they're shared, the more the in principle becomes actualized, the more FE is reassured, the more FE feels validated. So we know that FI doesn't work like that at all, and that the legitimacy that FI seeks is a kind of dignity. This is important, so pay attention. Not that you wouldn't. It's a kind of dignity that accrues to its fundamental individuality. So if you like, instead of a validation by means of universal shareability, you get a validation seen as dignified by the fact that the feelings and values of the FI dominant are in the FI dominant, that they are not just passing through as in principle universal things, universal entities, because a direct consequence of seeing feelings and values as in principle universal is that, in a sense, you are a spokesperson for them, you're holding them, but you're not them. In the case of FI dominance, it is very much phenomenologically felt in the bones that the feelings and the emotions are, and the values, which are, I'll have to make a video about that at some point, elaborated out of more primitive feelings. Not just that, but the primitive feelings are fundamental, are in the person. They are of the person. And for this reason, they are profoundly singular. The singularity is the source of the dignity. In the case of FE, it is the universality that is the source of the dignity, okay? So quite distinct in this regard. But if we accept this, which at this time, we're just in the domain of judgment and we're not in the domain of fantasy. So what could be the fantasy origins of this priorizing of dignity as obtained through singularity of emotion, feeling, and values? I think that insofar as it is a judgment function, it is a slightly later fantasy. It is grounded in a slightly later fantasy than the fantasies of perception. We know that judgment, in any case, comes a little bit later in the life of the very, very young child. All these fantasies crop up very early anyways. And the mechanism by which a person, a very, 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 very young person, ends up favoring this or that core fantasy remain quite difficult to penetrate. Nevertheless, as you will see also in the case of TE, and as we have already seen in the case of TI, the judgment fantasies, if we may call them that, tend to be slightly later ones. Maybe about, around age 1, a little bit after age 1. And it's emerging, I think, pretty much at around the same time and under the same conditions as the FE fantasy. It's just that it opts for a different narrative, a different fantasy. It seeks to calm down the anxiety, right, of how the mother feels. The mother is not really around that much in the eyes of the child. The child may be temperamentally very sensitive to the mother not being around, and that might cause a lot of anxiety. The child also very quick to assume that if the mother is not around, or if when she holds the child somehow the coordination is not as good, there's frustration on the part of the child. Frustration can quickly lead to anxiety and wondering if the mother loves them. These really are questions and concerns that the very young child has. And whereas it seems that the very young child, when activating an FE fantasy, hallucinates, in inverted commas, that the mother's feelings can be, can mirror his own by his sheer just feeling a certain way. That's the omnipotence we always talk about at the root of these fantasies. The child essentially reasons, if I feel good, she feels good. If I feel loved, she feels loved. If I love myself, she loves me, right? And if she loves me, if I love her, she loves me, and so on. In the case of FI, that is not what's prioritized. What seems to be prioritized is not emotional mirroring, but emotional containment, leading to a form of emotional autarky and self-sufficiency and protection, such that the child seems to go about the fantasy on 2 stages, or 2 chapters, if you like, of the narrative. First chapter is the feeling of my mother loves me. Okay, my mother loves me. First part, because there's always points when the child feels this way. It's just that there's a fear that this might end. The early life of the child is very insecure in many ways and precarious, and psychically speaking. The second step is, well, now that I have experienced the love, I'm going to absorb this love into myself, so a dimension of incorporation, which we saw at work in the SE fantasy, and I'm going to keep it there protected and impervious to impingements from the outside. So there is a sense of a fantasy of emotional containment. I receive the love and I'm keeping it inside and I'm not letting it out. Nothing will touch it. And this is how they achieve a sense of safety. Safety from what? Of course, as always, from the primitive fear of death, primitive death anxiety. Crystallized into further psychological development, it becomes the blueprint for the way that FI dominants come across in terms of the self-sufficient autonomy and containment of their much more elaborated feelings and values. Guys, don't forget that you can support me on Patreon. I need you more than ever, so please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'd be so grateful if you did. I need you more than ever. It's only a few euros or dollars a month or a year. You have the 2 options. It goes a long way toward helping me. And you know that if you do that, you get access to a whole library of exclusive content called the Deep Dives, where you can have a lot more of my content exclusively to patrons. Also access to our Discord server, the Fourfold. Come join us in the community, interact with us on a daily basis. Also, don't forget about my 2 books on the INFJ, the Ecstatic Soul, which is my first book on the INFJ, all about the internal world of the INFJ. What is it like to think like an INFJ? Could be a summary of what this book is about. And its sequel, what is it like to live in the world like an INFJ in the Infinite Soul? These 2 books go well together, and they are essential to a deep understanding of this type. Give me a like, please, because this helps massively with the referencing. My views have been dropping a little lately, so I can really use that help. And I will see you tomorrow. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.